So hopefully you have a handout. This is going to be harder to follow without the handout. There's a lot of words on the handout because this is a short talk, but there's still a fair bit in it. So this is kind of to be thought of more as the start of a project than as the results of one. Starting to think about emergent spacetime as a result of a project that I had in thinking about the nature of grounding. And one thing that became pretty clear in thinking about grounding is that although everybody takes grounding and causation to be these distinct relations, nobody really has a very clear story about what the difference between grounding and causation is. Grounding is introduced as being non-causal dependence relation or something like that, but what it means for that dependence to be non-causal is never really cashed out. People just say that it's non-causal and leave it at that. And so once you come up with a criterion, there are lots of cases to apply the criterion to distinguish grounding from causation, and emergent spacetime is, I think, one of the most interesting ones of those. But this talk is just mostly going to focus on developing a plausible criterion to distinguish the two types of dependence relations. The actual application of it to emergent spacetime will be somewhat sketchy and programmatic, and that's the part of the paper that I'm hoping to develop more in the future, and discussions with people here in Chicago have already been very useful to that. So thank you to Nick and to Chris for organising this project and for inviting me along for a week or so. So I'm not really sure what the consensus is about the status of emergent spacetime, whether people take it to be grounded in the fundamental physical goings-on or to be caused by the fundamental physical goings-on. The kind of payoff of this talk, to foreshadow, is going to be that given some reasonably common views, I think the way people should think about that relationship is actually as a causal one. So the fundamental level causing there to be space-time and causing space-time to have the kind of features that it does. And that might be a somewhat surprising result. Whereas the kind of things you would need to say about space-time and how it emerges to make it be grounded in the fundamental level, which I take it is the picture that most people have in mind, might be somewhat unfamiliar things. And so it might be a little bit uncomfortable to have to say those things. But before we can get into the status of space-time as either grounded or caused in these emergent space-time theories, we need to develop a plausible criterion for distinguishing grounding from causation. And talking to Geneva, many people in Geneva know probably more about grounding than I do. It's the kind of centre for this stuff, so perhaps there is a kind of standard party line criterion in use there that I just don't know about, in which case I'd be very glad to hear it. But I haven't been able to find any clear account of the distinction between grounding and causation out there in the literature, so I had to try and come up with my own. And in the course of writing a paper called Metaphysical Causation, in which I was exploring the view that there really is no difference between grounding and causation, no fundamental difference anyway, that grounding is just another kind of causation. It's the kind of causation that goes on in the domain of metaphysics. Nobody really liked that view, but nobody also really agreed as to what that view got wrong, so what the real difference was. So everybody agreed there was a difference between grounding and causation, but nobody really agreed what it was. And I got three broad kinds of responses. One to do with the kinds of things that are related by the kinds of dependence involved. One that's to do with the status of the kinds of things, as abstract or concrete, that are related by the dependence relations involved. And then probably the most popular view about the difference between grounding and causation is that they are relations that stand in different connections to time. So I'm going to explore those three criteria briefly in turn. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly. There's a bit more detail on the handout than I'm going to go into, but I think all of these criteria don't work. And then I'm going to offer a criterion of my own, which I think works a bit better. So, guiding question then, what is the difference between grounding and causation? I'm going to assume that we have this notion of dependence, one thing depending on another. and that notion is kind of neutral on whether the dependence is causal or whether dependence is grounding. And for now, I'm just going to mean grounding to mean non-causal dependence. Some people think that kind of lumps together a whole load of kind of dependence under one heading that should be kept apart. So here, causal versus non-causal, if you like, but I'm going to continue to use the phrase causal versus grounding. So first possibility, assume, and again, there's lots of preliminaries here. I'm going to assume that these relations of dependence can be thought of as genuine relations. Some people deny that. I don't really think it's going to make a big difference for these purposes, whether we think of grounding as some kind of primitive operator on sentences or something like that instead of a relation. So I'm just going to think of it as a relation. And when you have a relation, there's immediately the question of what kind of things can be related by that relation, what the kind of relata of a grounding relation or a causal relation are. And one perhaps promising criterion for distinguishing grounding from causation is that they might take different types of thing as relata. So perhaps the most popular view, though there are many views here of grounding, is that it relates facts, whereas the most popular view of causation is that it relates events. So you might use that as a distinction between grounding and causation. You might say that dependence as it applies to events is causal, dependence as it applies to facts is grounding. But I don't really think that distinction is going to work. And my reason for thinking that is that I think the arguments for treating causation as between events there are arguments for treating causation as between facts, and those apply equally well to causation and to grounding. Likewise, there are arguments for treating grounding as relating events, and those work equally well for causation. So the arguments in both domains take parallel forms, and I think they're equally powerful. So depending on what your reasons for thinking that grounding relates facts are, or depending on what your reasons for thinking that causation relates events are, you might equally have those sorts of reasons in the opposite, in the other domain, with the result being that we haven't really got any good reasons for distinguishing between grounding and causation with respects to their relata. So start with, I guess, the standard view that assume the standard view that grounding relates facts is right. Now ask about causation. Does that only relate events and not facts? I think there's a strong reason to think that causation does in fact relate facts and not events. Maybe usually it relates facts about events, fine, but still in general what it relates are facts, and that reason comes from causation by and of absences. So these are a familiar kind of puzzle case in the causation literature, and I'm just going to kind of cite and endorse these arguments used by Humella from the occurrence of absence causation to the conclusion that in full generality causation relates facts. So when you have an absence, the kind of failure to water some plants causing the plants to die, it doesn't seem like there's any event in the vicinity which can be clearly identified as the not watering. There are lots of events that might count as the not watering, and unlike an event of watering, those events of not watering aren't kind of clearly localized. They're not clearly the kind of things that any individual person did. Kind of everybody failed to water the plant, so who was responsible for the not watering? Whereas there is a straightforward fact in the vicinity, the fact that the plants were not watered. And the kind of the root of this difference is that facts have a kind of proposition-like structure. They can naturally be negated. Whereas events don't have that proposition-like structure. They can't naturally be negated. The negation of an event isn't just another obvious event, whereas the negation of a fact is obviously another fact. So if you take absence causation seriously, I think you have reason to think that causation relates facts. And of course, you can still recover everything you might want to have said about event causation in terms of fact causation. It's just causation between facts that certain events occur. So everything that event causation can do, fact causation can do also. And given that maybe most causation isn't absence causation, most causation is just kind of causation between facts about events, it's easy to see why we might have thought that all causation was event causation. So that is good reason for thinking that causation actually relates facts like grounding ordinarily does. But suppose you reject that, and you think that if causation always and only ever relates events. Well, still that's not a clear way of distinguishing causation from grounding if there are arguments that grounding also relates events, and I think there are. So Jonathan Schaffer argues in his work on grounding that grounding is a kind of topic-neutral relation. It can take any kinds of category of thing as its relator. So it can relate facts, but it can also relate events and concrete objects, people, abstract objects like sets, not just the facts that the event occur or that the set exists, but the event itself or the set itself. And I think the reasons for thinking that causation relates events are actually very similar to those reasons that Schaffer gives for thinking that grounding relates events. Simple case, people often say the singleton set of a thing is grounded in the thing that is a member of that set. So the set containing me is grounded in me. Likewise for events, you can have sets that contain events, so grounding can relate events by relating an event to the set containing that event. That seems like a grounding relation, it relates events, so it can't always be that grounding relates only facts. So I think for kind of the mixture of the kind of reasons I've been discussing, this criterion based on the category of the relator doesn't really work. For time reasons, I'm going to skip the concreteness criterion here. I think it's pretty much a non-starter. The very same kinds of examples of sets containing events, I think, already undermine this criterion. I'm going to move to what I think is the most interesting criterion, and the one that people have taken most seriously, the one that I've heard most often in conversation in response to the view that grounding is just a kind of causation, which is a temporal criterion that says grounding and causation have different relations to time. So the temporal criterion is on the handout. Causation is a diachronic relation, whereas grounding is a synchronic relation. So I'm going to talk in terms of facts for simplicity. So on the fact way of thinking about things, the criterion would become that causation relates facts that are facts about different times, whereas grounding relates facts that are facts about one single time. And the very kind of most basic paradigm cases of causation and grounding do seem to back up the temporal criterion. So if I kind of throw a rock and a window smashes, the throwing of the rock and the smashing of the window, the cause and the effect did occur at different times. Likewise, grounding. If we can make sense of a time at which a set exists, then my set exists at the very same times at which I exist, so the grounding is a synchronic relation between those facts. The fact about me existing is a fact about the same time as the fact that's about my set existing. But once we move beyond those paradigm cases, I think the criterion starts to break down. And in fact, I think there are clear examples of diachronic grounding. Actually, I think there are plenty of examples of synchronic causation as well, and it's only this kind of commitment to this temporal criterion that makes people unwilling to recognize synchronic causation. But because I think diachronic grounding cases are probably clearer examples than cases of synchronic causation, I think they're the best ones to focus on when criticizing this criterion. So, first kinds of cases, backwards causation or circular time. These seem to be cases of causation where you might have, if you have a time traveler that comes back and then causes some effect in their earlier life, then you have a kind of circular causal loop, and a fact at the very same time can be both the cause and effect, because they're part of this loop both as a cause and an effect. That would be a case of synchronic causation. Likewise, in circular time scenarios, again, I don't think these are hugely satisfying, because you can make a distinction which is familiar in philosophy of physics and metaphysics of time travel between personal time and external time, or what I'm going to call local time and global time. So in the light of that, you might say, even though these causal loops that come around to where they start involve causation that is synchronic with respect to global time, it's still diachronic with respect to local time, because the local time is time around the loop, and cause and effect are kind of diachronic with respect to that time ordering, even if they're synchronic with respect to the global time ordering. And I think that response is relatively plausible. There are more epicycles to that argument, but I'm not going to go into it. As I said, I'm going to focus on these cases of apparent diachronic grounding. So what would diachronic grounding be? It would be grounding of facts about one time in facts that are about another time. So I think there are actually plenty of examples that are fairly mainstream of this in ordinary metaphysics. So what makes me human isn't, on most views about humanity and species, just facts about the way my particles are arranged now. There's also facts about my ancestry. So there's this kind of swamp man example. If randomly in a swamp particles would come together to make something that's shaped like a person, that person wouldn't be a human, because they wouldn't have the right kind of causal history, they wouldn't have the right kind of ancestry, wouldn't be descended from other humans, or from the kind of ancestors that humans have. So my, in fact, being a human depends on my having the right kinds of causal history, but that's a diachronic relation. It's a relation of me to some earlier event, to facts about some earlier events. And then once you see that general kind of pattern, you can see how to generalize these sorts of cases. Maybe being a church depends on having been consecrated at some earlier time. What it is to be a church is to have been consecrated earlier. And maybe mental states necessarily depend on some kind of causal interaction to be about an object. You can't have a belief that's about something if you've never causally interacted with that thing at all. And there's never been a causal chain connecting you with that thing. Your thought wouldn't really be about that thing without the causal interaction, but the causal interaction occurred earlier. So again, we have a relation of diachronic grounding here. And in general, we have these locutions kind of an ex-con, an ex-president, an ex-whatever. That pretty clearly seems to depend on having been the thing at an earlier time that you are now an ex of. And likewise for the future. To be a future president is somebody that will be a president, and you can be kind of, can be both a X thing and a future thing. If you were something and you will be it again, but you're not it now. So those kinds of relations seem to be diachronic relations, but they also seem to be relations of something like grounding and metaphysical dependence, not causation. And there are views in the theory of time, in the metaphysics of time, that take grounding also to go across times. Facts about the past and future to be grounded in the present. So I'm not going to go into these views, but the kind of key point here is that I don't think those views are incoherent in virtue of what they say about grounding. They may be incoherent in virtue of saying necessarily false things about time, because they may be false views about time, and maybe views about time are necessary. But it seems like it's not what they say about grounding that is the root of the problem here. If they're wrong, if they're necessarily false at all, it's because they're necessarily false about time. So maybe those reasons against temporal criterion aren't decisive, but I think they give us some reasons to look for an alternative criterion. And I have an alternative criterion to offer. So the original version of this paper was classifying types of dependence by their modal strengths. So roughly whether they held contingently or they held non-contingently. And that was kind of in the abstract that was circulated. That was what the criterion was going to be. I now think that that criterion is not a great criterion. I've been convinced that although generally speaking modal grounding connections are non-contingent, whereas causal connections are contingent, that is kind of a side effect of the correct demarcation criterion rather than itself being the right demarcation criterion. And so I now am going to defend a criterion in the vicinity of that, which I think has the kind of consequence that the modal statuses of the two relations are generally different, but it's actually not about their modal status, it's about what they in turn depend on. So I'm calling it a metadependence criterion, because the criterion essentially says what makes a difference between grounding and causation is what the dependence relation, either the causal relation or the grounding relation, itself depends on. So think again in terms of facts. If you have fact A depending on fact B, fact A being the case because fact B is the case, that itself is a further fact, the fact that A depends on B. And so we can ask what that fact itself, the dependence fact, depends on. And the classification of grounding versus causation I'm going to be suggesting uses that kind of metadependence, and it says that when you have a causal relation, a causal dependence relation, what that dependence relation depends on involves the laws of nature. Whereas when you have a non-causal dependence relation, that dependence relation does not itself depend on the laws of nature. Maybe it depends on some principles of metaphysics or of mathematics or something like that. But the basic criterion is, if the laws of nature are involved in, if they are responsible, partly responsible for the dependence fact, then that dependence fact gets to count as a causal fact, as opposed to a grounding fact. And I think that captures all the paradigm examples. When you have a rock being thrown and breaking a window, the laws of nature are involved in that dependence relation holding. If the laws had been very different, then that dependence relation might not have obtained. It's because the laws are as they are that that dependence relation obtains. Whereas the kinds of classic examples of grounding are not like that. So the laws of nature just have nothing to do with whether the existence of my singleton set depends on my existence. What has to do with that are the principles of set theory. Those aren't laws of nature. So I think this criterion gets most of the key cases right, and I kind of like it enough. I think it's also kind of intuitively plausible, but I like it enough that I think that if we found some surprising consequences from it, there would be at least some pressure to take those as discoveries rather than counterexamples. So, in the last few minutes of the talk, I'm going to get onto the emergent spacetime now and apply this kind of metadependence criterion for demarcating causation from grounding to the status of emergent spacetime. And the application might turn out to be a little anticlimactic, because it's really going to just make some assumptions about the modal status of what space-time is and the modal status of the laws of nature. So one way we could do this was to kind of ask directly where we have space-time depending on some more fundamental physical structure, so that space-time is non-fundamental, instead is derivative or emergent. What kind of dependence is that? Consult our intuitions about that dependence. What the metadependence criterion says, don't just consult your intuitions about what kind of dependence that is, rather consult your intuitions about what that dependence depends on. Does it depend on the laws of nature, or does it depend on some principle of metaphysics? And I don't think that is necessarily the right way to go, because I don't necessarily think our intuitions about what dependence depends on are completely reliable. And in particular, I think it would be a mistake to just argue, well, because physics is what has told us that space-time is emergent, if it has, then clearly that dependence depends on the laws of nature, because physics is about the laws of nature, right? And so if physics is telling us that space-time is emergent, then the dependence between space-time and the fundamental non-space temporal reality must itself depend on the laws of nature. But I think that would be too quick a line of argument, because I think as well as often telling us about the laws of nature, physics can also tell us about some principles of metaphysics. It can tell us about the principles by which things are constituted. So chemistry, for example, tells us about laws of chemistry maybe, but it also tells us about the constitution of some chemical substances. And that what water is, that water is H2O, isn't ordinarily taken to be a law of nature. It's telling us about the nature or the essence or what it is to be, or the constitution or something like that of water. And likewise in physics sometimes. So in telling us that the temperatures of macroscopic objects depend on their mean molecular kinetic energies, I don't think that physics gave us a law of nature connecting mean molecular kinetic energy with temperature. Rather, it was a kind of theoretical identification. That's what temperature is. And so if physics can sometimes come up with these theoretical identifications, these sorts of principles about the nature of something, about the constitution, rather than just with laws, then maybe that's what's going on in the present case. So the kind of question comes down to, when physics is telling us that space-time is emergent, if it is it telling us about some law of nature that connects the fundamental level with space-time, or is it telling us about the nature of space-time itself? Is it telling us what it is to be space-time? And one way of kind of assessing what it's doing is to look at what we take the modal status of that connection to be. Because laws of nature are typically assumed to be contingent. They vary from possible world to possible world. I actually defend the view in other work that laws of nature are non-contingent, but that makes this argument harder, so set it aside. Also, nobody else accepts that, really. But just assuming that laws of nature are contingent, and the also standard view that principles of metaphysics are non-contingent, which again some people question, but it's a pretty minority view that they're not, so I'm going to set it aside. We can use our views about whether worlds without emergent space-time are metaphysically possible to help guide our assessment about whether this dependence relation is causation or grounding. So assume, as most philosophers of physics seem to do, that Newtonian worlds with substantivalist space-time are possible. It may not be true at the actual world, but physics as Newton envisaged it is a genuine possibility. There are Newtonian worlds, people say. So consider a Newtonian world, ... If in such a world, if there is such a world, space-time is not emergent, it's fundamental. In which case, given that the laws of metaphysics, so to speak, seem to be non-contingent, whereas the laws of nature are contingent, the relation between the fundamental level and space-time is varying from world to world. Space-time is fundamental at Newtonian worlds, it's non-fundamental at string theory worlds. So the only thing that could be mediating that contingent connection would itself be a law of nature. So I'm suggesting that in that scenario, if we take both those theories to be reflect genuine possibilities, we should take string theory to be specifying laws of nature that connect the fundamental level to space-time, and then Newtonian mechanics to be specifying a kind of trivial law of nature connecting the fundamental level to space-time. The law is just some kind of identity type law. But if we instead think that Newtonian worlds are actually impossible, that all of the worlds in which there is space-time are worlds in which it emerges in the same way that it emerges in string theory, then it's natural to take what string theory has discovered to be the nature of space-time. What it is to be space-time is to be something which emerges in that same sort of way from the fundamental level. In which case then it's natural to think that the dependence of space-time on the fundamental level isn't in fact something mediated by the laws of nature, it's mediated by facts about the nature of space-time. In which case the dependence comes out, according to my criterion, as grounding rather than causation. So, although these aren't the only this isn't the only basis on which you might attempt to argue to apply the meta-dependence criterion to emergent space-time, I think it's a kind of straightforward, natural way, and it exposes the debate about the status of space-time as emergent or grounded to both to assumptions about what space-time is, kind of any views you might independently have about the essence of space-time, and to assumptions you would make about the modal status of the laws of nature and of principles of metaphysics, whether they're contingent or necessary. So on the standard view about the modal status of the laws of nature and of metaphysics, I think it does follow that if Newtonian worlds are possible, then in quantum gravity, space-time is caused to exist rather than grounded. And likewise, if you think that doesn't follow automatically, but I think there's strong pressure to think that if Newtonian worlds aren't possible, and the kind of in all worlds space-time emerges in the way in which it does in quantum gravity, then space-time is grounded rather than caused. But given that the standard view is that Newtonian worlds are possible, I think this provides an argument for emergent space-time being caused to exist rather than grounded to exist, so to speak. And that's probably a surprising conclusion, because most people don't think of emergent space-time as being caused to exist. But if this criterion is right, and if the standard views about the possibility of fundamental space-time are right, then I think we should accept that surprising conclusion. Okay, thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, I've been thinking about some similar issues, and we just finished a reading group actually last week on Shepard's grounding the image of causation, and it suggested in terms of the structural similarity between these two notions. And I think it's very important to bring out how these two are different, and I think the criteria we went through are very suggestive too. So let's just ask more about the policy proposal, the meta-dependence criteria. So as you think of it, the full dependence between cause and effect at least partly depends on laws of nature. However, the full dependence between the grounded and the ground does not. So one is clarification, the other thing is some example I think might be a counterexample. So just a clarification first. So when we say at least partly depends on the laws of nature, here we are assuming laws of nature primitive, Armstrongian, Malthusian, or
no, we're not necessarily making that assumption at all. Like whatever you think the laws of nature are like, they're the kinds of things that dependence relation might depend on. So I think that this would work even if you were a Humean, because even Humeans will characterize causation partly in terms of their Humean laws, like David Lewis did.
But not in terms of, say, when we say, proposal for grounding, suppose some ground relation depends on laws of nature. That would not be the kind of thing we want to say if we are Humeans, right? There will be a singularity of dependent structure.
So I'm not sure what.
Just to make the second claim meaningful, that suppose it's meaningful to say that for grounding theories who's Humean, that a certain grounding fact depends on the laws of nature, and laws of nature depend on mosaic. Mosaic contains the grounding facts. That you have the circularity. That's not looking for the grounding theorist who is also Humean.
Yeah,
So
I mean,
make this open option, right?
I'm still not sure I see the problem. I mean, the mosaic doesn't involve any grounding facts for the Humean. The mosaic just involves the occurrent facts. If Humean are going to recognise some grounding facts, as apparently some of them do, even though I don't think Lewis would have liked grounding at all, then those facts don't go into the mosaic. They're kind of separate.
Yeah, let's say
they're facts about how the mosaic relates to other things.
Let's say X grounds Y. X is in the mosaic. Y is not in the mosaic. The fact that X grounds Y could probably depend on laws of nature. But then the fact that X grounds Y involves X, which is in the mosaic. And then laws of nature also depends on something in the mosaic. Then you have circularity here.
But I was thinking that any fact that X grounds Y wouldn't depend on the laws of nature. That was the proposal. If it was a fact about X depending on Y that itself depended on laws of nature, then it would ipso facto be a causal relation, not a grounding relation.
That's interesting, because I was thinking that for this quantity mutable, the magnetic theory also makes sense for a grounding theory for human. But let's set aside. But so I guess, let's see. So what do you think of this example? Suppose take your example that being human, being human, being human consisting of grounding in fully, my say part was arranged certain ways, and over time, okay, and
so that's to assume that these assumptions I was making in the arguments against the temporal criterion are false. So in fact, being human is just being arranged human-wise, having a particle arranged human-wise. It's not having the right causal history.
Can take an entire stretch of space-time. The lump of matter that over time determines what makes human.
Right, but not about my parent.
Let's take ancestry as well.
Okay, so the particles arranged ancestor-wise as well. Okay.
Okay. And then suppose, okay, do you think this is true? That is, that fact, that dependence fact, depends partly on laws of nature. Because if the causal relations were different, then wouldn't say this kind of lump of matter over stretch of time, equally its ancestry, is kind of human. Suppose it's kind of fragile disposition. That is, if you kind of hit this person with something, it can modify, and if you kind of push this person or target this person, it kind of induces a big bang, and if you kick this person, I guess this person disappears. Whatever. So the disposition would be not fitting the human disposition.
Right. So again, I'm not totally sure I was following, but I think what I need to distinguish here is whether the ground and the grounded effect occur, from whether, given that they occur, the one depends on the other. So I'm thinking whether the one or the other occur will depend on the laws of nature, but whether, given that they occur, that one depends on the other isn't going to depend on the laws of nature in cases of grounding. It's just going to depend on kind of metaphysical principles. So that's probably something I should have made clearer. It's not whether A occurs, or kind of A obtains and B obtains and A depends on B. That whole conjunction depends on the laws or not. Usually it will, because whether A occurs and whether B occur will depend on the laws. But I'm just focusing on the conjunction, given that A obtains and that B obtains, whether there is a dependence relation between them, whether that depends on the laws or not, is what the criterion is checking.
Let's see.
Running out of time.
Oh, okay.
So you guys can talk about this after.
Yeah, we've got plenty of time.
Maria, you got a question?
Hi, thanks for your talk. So here's an alternative criterion. I'm just curious. It actually is very similar to things that you said near the end. So grounding is a relation that makes a contribution to what a thing is. Causation isn't.
So I mean, depending on how you cash that out, maybe. I'm not, but maybe that would. But I mean, I'm kind of thinking of cheesy examples like my parents made a contribution to what I am, but they certainly caused my existence. So making a contribution to what a thing is doesn't rule out being a cause.
Right. So I'm thinking the ground of a thing.
Yeah.
Partly defines the thing.
Okay, so I mean, maybe I could endorse it. I think it would be reasonably. You wouldn't need that many kind of. I think with reasonably plausible premises, you might be able to kind of connect that up to the proposal I'm making, because laws of nature typically aren't. I mean, depending on what exactly definition is, it's kind of plausible that the laws of nature themselves don't get involved in those facts about what a thing is, how a thing gets a real definition. I'm not sure that I would want to think of all cases of grounding in terms of definition. So maybe these cases that people come up with of logical grounding. So A and B is the case because A is the case, and because B is because A is the case, and also A and B is the case because B is the case, or even easier, disjunction. If A and B are both true, then A or B is fully grounded in A and it's fully grounded in B. But I'm not sure that maybe A and B are involved in defining A or B. Actually, that does seem very plausible. Yeah. I mean, I'm not sure. I'd like to say, here's what I would like to say. Such a view might be fine. I'm not sure whether it's kind of going to falsify the criterion that I come up with, but maybe it's kind of gives equivalent results. What I'm trying to do though is to avoid using notions which are controversial here. So actually, the meta-dependence criterion doesn't use the notion of ground or of definition or anything like that at all. The idea is that we can make sense of dependence, and the kind of meta-dependence criterion just uses more dependence. Before I was assuming that we could make sense of modality and my criterion was using just modality. But still, I think if you're in a position to be understanding dependence and asking of a particular dependence relation, whether it's grounding or causal, you have to already understand dependence, and this is just using more dependence, plus the notion of a law of nature. So my aim is to try and give a criterion which is going to be kind of comprehensible to people, even if they don't accept notions like real definition or essence. And I think more people accept the notion of a law of nature than accept the notion of real definition or essence. But maybe I might flip it around and say, yes, I accept your criterion, and I'm going to use it to help understand what real definition is or what essences are, something like that. So I can be, I think, kind of friendly towards that suggestion too, without it being a problem for the proposal.
One advantage for this alternative proposal is that, as you acknowledged in your talk, you're assuming that the laws of nature are contingent, and maybe that's right, but it's a controversial question. You might not want to take a stand on that issue merely for the purpose of characterizing the difference between two relations.
So I'm not assuming it for the purpose of characterizing the difference between the two relations, actually. The causal criterion, the meta-dependence criterion counts things as dependencies of causal if those dependencies depend on the laws of nature, whatever the modal status of the laws of nature is. So it would work just as well for necessary laws as for contingent laws.
Right,
the only thing that assumed that laws were contingent was the specific application of it to emergent spacetime. So maybe the criterion is harder to apply if laws are necessary, but I don't think it undermines the criterion altogether.
But in introducing the criterion, you said there's this idea that causation is contingent and that grounding isn't. that's, I as a you think that that's not false, but that might be an accidental truth.
Yeah.
The real truth sort of underlying it is this. So I thought it was at least
Yeah.
a kind of desideratum that you wanted to capture.
Right. That was less of a desideratum and more of a kind of transition from the old proposal to the new proposal. So the old proposal, I think, did rely on that view about laws to be plausible. Whereas I'm thinking that the new proposal, one of its advantages is it doesn't rely on that view about laws to be plausible. So the bottom line is I would hope that to come up with a criterion that doesn't actually make that assumption about laws, not least because I think it's false myself.
Yeah.
But thanks.
Okay, I think we need to wrap it up because these guys in Geneva need to go off and eat some chocolate or something.
Is it possible to questions? So do you consider the emergence contingent? If you have two different, say, worlds with the same laws, could it be that the space-time doesn't emerge in one of those, and it does in another one?
So I think that is kind of absolutely what is kind of up for grabs here, and I don't want to commit either way. So, I mean, people mean many things by emergence, and in kind of the metaphysics literature, people often mean something like kind of strong emergence, whereby there is something like extra laws that generate higher level states of affairs out of lower level states of affairs in some kind of indeterministic way or something like that. So new properties appear that don't reduce to the lower level properties in any straightforward way, and those principles I think are usually thought of as mediated by the laws of nature. So that kind of emergence would end up counting as causation. But focusing specifically on emergent space-time, that's not usually the kind of emergence that kind of philosophers of physics have in mind. I think what philosophers of physics have in mind is a kind of what metaphysicians more often call weakly emergent. So the idea would be that even though you kind of don't obviously see when you look at it's not kind of obvious to you when you look at the fundamental equations that this is a world that has space-time in it. Nonetheless, there is space-time in, and you have to kind of put in some modelling assumptions and put in some particular circumstances and do some work, and then you find that there is something which is functionally like space-time, deserves to be called space-time, coming out at some higher level. But it's not like there's kind of spooky extra laws that don't reduce to the fundamental laws that give rise to that. It's a kind of non-spooky kind of emergence. And again, whether the physics, if we understand the relation between the fundamental level and the non-fundamental level in these theories as this kind of sort of weak emergence, I think whether we're compelled to think of that as mediated by laws of nature or as kind of principles about the natures of things that physics has discovered for us is going to depend whether it is going to be whether we count this as causation or grounding ends up going by. I hope that answers the question a bit.
So, I mean, can I just do a follow-up to what Al's said?
Is the microphone? Yeah, okay.
Hold on a second. I'm going to abuse my privileges.
Go ahead.
I mean, but for those of you who saw Daniele Oritti's talk, I mean, part of the point is one thing that can happen in quantum gravity, right, is, I mean, there are just different sectors of the theory, and some states do correspond to a classical space-time, and some just don't. So then it seems contingent in that case. Let me go give the other question. Right. I just wanted to throw that in.
Okay, let's talk more about that later, because I think that might be a different notion of contingency. I mean, well, actually, it might be a different notion of contingency, but also it might be it might depend on whether, for example, you're Everettian and think that all domains kind of are populated or not. But we'll come back to that.
Sure. Okay, Geneva, go ahead with your last question.
No, please continue.
That was a follow-up, so if you want.
Okay. Yeah, then I guess I have a question about the final argument you draw. So about the part which starts that suppose that the substantivalist Newtonian world is impossible and space-time emerges from some fundamental basis. And then you go on to say that then facts about what space-time depends on are non-contingent. But that kind of seems to assume that the basis from which space-time emerges is unique, and maybe there is no need to claim that it is the case. So, maybe we have a variety of situations in which space-time is emergent. In some cases, it emerges from, say, just a partial order, and in some other cases from some fractal-like structure, and in some other case from something completely different. And then I guess that would kind of complicate the argument you have here, because in this case, I guess the facts about what space-time depends on still would depend on the laws of nature, which would correlate this or that basis with space-time, right? So I'm wondering whether one should not be a bit more careful with that part of the argument here.
Yeah. So I think you're absolutely right about that. I should have been more careful there. And I agree that what matters is not whether space-time is non-fundamental in all the worlds that it exists, but whether it is non-fundamental in the same way in all those worlds. So I'm kind of thinking of a world where suppose string theory is right about how space-time emerges, but nonetheless there are various different string theories with say different parameters in them, or different or kind of minor tweaks to the theory that will agree about how space-time emerges but disagree about the laws. That would be a case, I think, where we have grounding. But if we had multiple different theories of emergent space-time all being possible, so maybe causal set theory describes a possible world, and string theory describes a possible world, and loop quantum gravity describes a possible world, but all of the theories which describe which are possible, describe possible worlds, still have that emergent feature, then, as you say, how it emerges would depend on the laws of physics. So it would end up getting counting as causation then. So it's not, you're right, it's not to do with whether space-time is emergent at all worlds, but whether it's emergent in the same way at all worlds. Does that answer the question? Yeah.
Thanks.
Okay. Well, I think then, I'm sorry, there was a question emailed in, but I think we're really out of time, unfortunately.
Sorry for going on.
Thanks again, to Al, and also again to Eddie, who's still here. And thanks for the questions, Geneva, and see you in a couple of weeks, whenever the next one is. Take care. Bye.